I'm guessing that many of you have seen at least one piece of marketing material for the new Mario movie. Seems to be everywhere. I went to watch the trailer looking for something that would make a fun and captivating diorama, preferably with lights. And after watching it a few times, the thing that stood out to me the most wasn't actually in the trailer, but it was the thumbnail for the trailer. I found a poster of that image, and I thought this looked pretty nice. So that's what I'm going to try and make today. But there's no guarantee it'll be that peaceful by the end of the video. I ran around to a couple different stores looking for Mario figures in the correct scale. And honestly, these were a little pricey. I'm used to wargaming prices, but I guess I'm out of the loop on soft plastic Mario figures. They're like $50. Once out of the box, I popped the figures out of the trays, at least the good guys. But I still have to figure out what to do with all the bad guys. Considering how much I paid for them, I do want to use them eventually. So if you have ideas for how to use the bad guys, let me know in the comments. This isn't the exact lineup that's shown on the poster, but it's close enough. I may have to adjust some of their poses in a little bit. But the plan here is to make two boats. One for Peach, Toad, and Mario, and the other for Luigi and Yoshi. To make the boats, I'll be using some pink XPS insulation foam, which I ripped on my hot wire table down to thinner strips that I could repurpose as wooden planks. And once that was done, I ripped them a long way to make even smaller strips. Don't be fooled by that sloppy match cut. I did actually have to cut them all by hand. To get the correct sizing for the boats, I set the characters down on a plank of foam and traced around them to make sure everybody would fit. I did this a little incorrectly though, because Peach is in the middle. I will have to adjust the size of her skirt later on to accommodate a mast. I copied the cutout of the bottom of the boat so that both of the boats would be the same size, and then I began building the boats. I used some foam-safe super glue, started stacking those thinner strips of foam to build the whole. After adding a bit of trim and a flat piece to top the sides, I shaved off a little bevel along the bottom, and then I etched some wood grain on the side. I did that for the first boat, but not the second. I'm not sure why. Well, I just forgot. That's what it is. It was now time to change the positioning of the legs on Mario and Luigi, because I thought they would be sitting down. I was actually wrong about that. So this whole step was unnecessary and not really noticeable in the end. But I'll show you the process anyways, because it's kind of fun. Honestly, Mario's legs are actually so short you can barely tell that he's bending them. He's got the dimensions of a baby. I also adjusted all of the head positions of the figures so that they were looking up, watching shooting stars soar above their heads. And like I said before, I made a little bit more room in the bottom of the boat by changing the size of Peach's skirt. There needed to be standing room for Toad and a mast, and that just wasn't the case before. After the first boat was done, I completed the second one and began working on the masts. I don't even know if they're called masts when they're in a tiny boat like this, but I'm sure that somebody who knows something about boats will let me know in the comments. The unique thing about the sails on these tiny boats is that they're shaped like stars. I'm not sure how efficient that is from a catch in the wind perspective, but then again, it's in the Mushroom Kingdom, and I think that they value aesthetics over efficiency. Anyway, I made two of those from a plastic-backed canvas drop cloth, and then I lined the edges with something rigid, which in my case were styrene rods. I guess that apparently helps the star keep its shape. Again, it's about form over function. After the edges of each star had been lined, I threw a crossbar on both of them, I glued down the masts, and then I glued the sails to the masts using those crossbars. I then tied down the front point of each star, as I saw in the photo, using a small piece of braided wire. And just as I was wrapping up the construction on these boats, a new trailer for the second Mario movie dropped, so I watched that, and something in there caught my eye right away. Do my eyes deceive me, Or are those LED filaments? I gotta include this. So if you remember the original plan, I was gonna make this poster, but if you zoom in right here, up on this little hill at the back, you can see Peach's castle. I think Peach's castle just got abducted by a UFO, which means I can integrate that into this same diorama, and we're good to go. That leads me to the next phase of the build, which is of course the base. I was planning on doing a backdrop and then integrating some shooting stars, but now I have another plan. I cut up more XPS foam to use as the base, sliced up half of that into lots of little pieces to make the hills that will be at the far end. I got that stack glued up using some foam safe super glue, and then I broke out my hot wire table to shape the hill. Or hills, I should say. I will be adding a smaller hill on either side of the big one. Here you can see the layout of the diorama starting to come together, and I'm not sure how many of you have seen my first Mario movie diorama, but the layout of this one reminds me a lot of that one. If you haven't seen that video and you like Mario, you should go watch that one next. It's one of my favorites. Next, I added a little in-between layer, which I shaved down to be like a sandy beach, which will help the transition between the sea and the hills. On the large hill, I noticed that there was a waterfall, which I made a small groove for, and then it was time for some sanding of those hills, just to get them a little bit smoother, and then I glued everything in place. And when I say I glued everything together, I don't really mean everything. I did put the boats down temporarily and marked their spots. Then I masked that off with some masking tape, which will prevent the next step from ruining the effect of these boats sitting in the water. Once the masking tape was down, I broke out my butane torch and I went to town, lightly spotting the surface to create ripples and waves for a gentle ocean surface. Having a perfectly smooth surface isn't necessary, because the next step I will be covering all of this with foil. Making water using foil is a technique that I learned from a channel called Scalaton about 5 or 6 years ago. And it's a great alternative to resin if you don't need the transparency. I'll put a link to the video that I learned this on so that you can go learn it and use it yourself. After sizing the foil and cutting out the rough shape, I crinkled the foil into a ball and then I unraveled it very gently to get some nice microsurface detail, which would be nearly impossible to sculpt by hand. I then gently smoothed that out once again and glued the foil down to the foam using some foam safe super glue, and then I trimmed off the excess. And it's a little hard to tell, but I made the swells deeper and further apart in the foreground to add a little bit of forced perspective. After trimming the foil, the construction of the water was done, and I glued a small footbridge over the top of the waterfall and grabbed Peach's castle from my 3D printer. I'll link the file that I used below, but it did require a decent amount of work to print properly. Probably could have sculpted my own castle from clay in about half the time that it took me to get it ready for printing. Either way, I did end up with a scaled version of the castle, and then I began adding the surface texture. I took a little break from that though, because the castle is being trapped and then ripped away from the foundations after being cut by those laser beams. So that's what we're going to depict here. The floating castle is going to be holding up the weight of the UFO as well, so I made sure that was nice and sturdy using a brass rod. With the crater established, I then finished the process of texturing the terrain and gluing the castle to its little floating plot of dirt. I covered that with the mud texture as well, and I slotted it into position. The mud texture needed some time to dry, which meant that this was the perfect time to do another step that required dry time, which was a protective shell of gloss Mod Podge over the foil. I threw that on and spread it out with my gloved hand. And while that's drying, it's time to work on the UFO. So I grabbed a bunch of round things that I had in my bits box. Most of these things were not made to be stuck to other things, so I flame annealed them to encourage them to stick to each other. After some heated persuasion and gluing of all the little bits, I was left with a UFO that, after I tested against the filaments, was way too small for the angle that I have it sitting above the castle. The beams would go through the castle. And I didn't really have any other round things on hand, at least not round things in the correct size. So I had to alter the shape and design of the UFO to accommodate a different beam angle. Hopefully that's not offensive to any of the viewers out there. At this point, I threaded some wires through the new arms into the body of the spacecraft, where I twisted them together as placeholders. Partly space holders. I'll still be using the same wires, but I'll do all of the soldering and connecting the filaments a little later on. I also punched a hole through each of the boats and through the base to be able to run some wires for lanterns that are suspended on the masts. The terrain and the Mod Podge were dry now, so I brought out an old hobby mat and it was time to begin painting. I got gloved up and masked up, and I grabbed my airbrush, which I first loaded with black primer, which I followed with a medium gray primer, followed by a basically white gray primer, which I applied to the water and to the boats. I turned up the PSI on my compressor because the black primer was so thick, and I forgot to turn it down for the white primer. After a light zenithal highlight on the castle and the hills, I loaded up the airbrush with some brown ink, which I tinted the hills and the boats with. And I can already hear the comments saying, hey, the hills were already brown. Why'd you have to paint them black and then zenithal and brown again? I don't know, man. Don't worry about it. After the boats were done, it was time to paint the water, starting with a light green. And right off the bat, you can see that I'm concentrating the color in the valleys and almost avoiding the peaks entirely, working from light to dark. I wrapped that up with a light blue gradient along the shoreline and then painted on a sandy beach. The beach was the last thing that needed to be painted with the airbrush. And then I broke out a hairdryer and made sure that everything was dry before the next step. Static grass would be nearly impossible to clean up, get out of paint without messing it up. I loaded up the applicator and then dabbed on some static tack before covering the whole top of each hill with green grass. After the static grass, I flipped the diorama over, shook off the excess, and then I added some green flocking, which honestly would have probably been sufficient and better for this scale. But it is what it is. I sealed the whole thing with isopropyl alcohol and watered down white glue. The next step was to paint the castle, and for this I'll just be using a brush. Started with white walls, followed by the classic red roof. And it's honestly been a really long time since I've played Super Mario 64, but painting this little castle brought back a lot of fond memories. After painting the castle, the next step was to fill up the waterfall using some UV resin, which I added in layers to create layers that I then painted with some white water effects from Woodland Scenics. With the paint now dry, you can see that the water is pretty matte and lacking depth, but a way we can fix that is to take it outside and add some gloss varnish. As you can see, that really does the trick. With the base done, the next step was to glue the boats in place. I used a small rod to make sure the holes lined up, and because the spots weren't affected by the butane torch, the boats sit perfectly flush with no issue. After the watercraft were done, it was time for the spacecraft and my little redesigned UFO. I added a green flexible filament which will provide the light for the tractor beam through some heat shrink rings on either side so I could actually glue it in place. And I soldered that to some wires, and this is the only LED that will have both the positive and the negative lead up inside the ship. The magenta filaments could all just be connected to the same polarity on the ship, and the other ends will all be easily connected to the other polarity somewhere inside the ground. In this case, it's all the negative leads that are soldered together up inside the UFO, but I tested my circuit to make sure everything was working, and I placed the UFO on top of its tractor beam. I used the same clear heat shrink trick on the other end of each of those magenta filaments, glued them in place under the castle, and made sure they were nice and taut. The boats in the photo all have these little lanterns on them that make it look dreamy and romantic, which I thought would be funny to pair with the stark contrast of the absolute destruction happening in the background. Originally, I was going to attempt shooting stars as well, but I ran out of time and I actually don't know how I would have pulled that off. Maybe I'll attempt that at some point in the future. The last thing to do was to glue all of our heroes in place, and after that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out, as always, to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.